Everybody. I'm streaming on both channels. I wasn't sure if I should, but I'm actually going to do another video explaining why antinatalism is actually a form of anarchy. It's parental anarchy. I'm not going to go into detail about that right now, but I'm going to do another live stream explaining that. So I think these topics are interrelated, but I'm going to get started talking about Nietzsche. This is going to be a two-part series because I'm going to first talk about the will to life as it relates to antinatalism, and then I'm going to do a follow-up explaining the will to power. Sorry, it's called the will to power. The will to life, the will to power when it comes to antinatalism, and then I'm going to address it when it comes to veganism. I've already talked about the will to power before, I'm sorry, I keep getting these terms, I keep getting them mixed up. The will to life. That was Arthur Schopenhauer's position. Arthur Schopenhauer described the will to life as a fundamental drive underlying all existence. It's the drive for procreation, for sex, for the constant striving. It leads us to a lot of irrational behavior. And that basically we should resist the will to life. And so Nietzsche actually rejected the will to life, and he came up with his own framework, which is called the will to power. So the will to power is descriptive, right, of reality's fundamental nature. According to Nietzsche, it's the engine that drives everything from not merely towards survival. That's why he rejected the will to life, because he thought that Schopenhauer's framework was inaccurate because it's not about striving for survival, but instead is towards expansion, growth, and self overcoming, pushing us to conquer our weaknesses and become who we are. Um, and the reason why the will to power is so important to understand is because this is the framework that basically that supposedly debunks antinatalism. When y'all listen to that debate between Jordan Peterson and David Benatar, David Benatar was presenting the will to life, and Jordan Peterson was presenting the will to power. So it's important to understand why they were coming at this from completely different perspectives. Jordan Peterson has repeatedly addressed Nietzsche, but I don't think he's ever addressed Schopenhauer. I would assume that he's read Schopenhauer, but anyway, let's keep going. So, from the will to power is the amor fati, which is the love of fate, right? That is so. The will to power is descriptive, and then amor fati is prescriptive. Uh, the love of fate is a prescriptive attitude of radical acceptance, the ability to look at every every crushing failure, every mundane moment in life and say yes to all of it. Not merely tolerating existence, but loving it, actually loving and accepting your fate so completely that one would not change a single detail. This is most people's position, right? Most people are. This is the reason why they reject antinatalism, because they are operating from a Nietzschean framework, that they have a radical acceptance of life. Um, and when I get into my discussion about veganism, I'm going to explain why veganism is basically half-hearted asceticism. They're life affirming in one way, but life denying in another way. So it's completely paradoxical. Um, don't don't hear me out before you unsubscribe. This actually makes sense, and I'm going to explain the contradiction. But until you hear the argument, don't be so quick to just automatically unsubscribe. Think that I'm just bashing on veganism. It's not veganism. It's the way that they're carrying it out. It's the way that they have defined it. But anyway, this wait until I actually explain it, and then you'll actually see what my position is. So the Nietzschean framework views antinatalism as embodying what he calls morality as a negation of the will to life, And he calls it decadence, right? That was very confusing. Why would he call it decadence? The reason why he calls it decadence is because it's an over focus, an over emphasis on preventing suffering as opposed to focusing on the um, opportunity for greatness. That again, that's what Jordan Peterson was focusing on. He was talking about how life was an opportunity. So under uh, Nietzsche's framework, that would be a form of decadence because you could be focusing on greatness and yet you're sitting here focusing on um, suffering and pain. Like, and Nietzsche would frame this as a weakness, which I'm going to explain why that his whole framework is a complete bundle of logical fallacies. Let's see who's here before I keep going. All right, y'all. This is going to be interesting for those who are interested in philosophy, but it really you have to understand why they're rejecting anti-nihilism. So so I just explained it. He rejected anti-nihilism because it prioritizes prevention of pain over achieving flourishing. Um, and then he uses a term called resentment. So, according to his framework, anti-nihilists are weak, exhausted, and like unable to bear life, but not because it's a refusal, because it's a weakness, right? Um, in his resentment against existence itself, we represent decadence, life turning against itself in decline. This is an ad hominem attack. That's the first logical fallacy. It says that basically we're weak. It's not because we think it's unethical. So consider an anti-nihilist who is strong, right? They bear their suffering without complaint, and they may even find meaning in their struggle. But that still does not give them the right to impose suffering onto a new being who cannot consent to existence. This is not weakness. This is an ethical argument about consent, autonomy, and imposition of harm. Um, it deserves a serious response as opposed to a dismissal to pathologize the person presenting the argument. So Nietzsche's will to power results in a surface level accusation of weakness about the person's ability to endure suffering without actually challenging the merits of anti-nihilism. So let's start out by talking about the anti-nihilist position. Existence necessarily involves suffering. We cannot attain consent from the non-existent. Therefore, creating a new person imposes an inescapable condition involving guaranteed harm without their consent. Imposing such harm without consent is unethical. Therefore, procreation is unethical. Um, Nietzsche's framework would basically he would take issue with the presupposition of putting a negative value on existence, right? That existence is a burden that requires justification. But his framework misses the point because the framework doesn't assume that existence is negative or that it is necessarily negative. It assumes that it imposes an irreversible high state condition on others without their consent, which therefore requires ethical justification. Um, and Nietzsche would accept that any action that imposes harm on others requires justification in any other context. But for whatever reason, there's always an exception when it comes to procreation. I think it's because of the non-entity problem, which I have already resolved in my book. I think I'm going to go over that over the weekend. But let's just use a counterfactual example. If I drug someone, put them on a plane, and drop them in a foreign country, where they would experience wonderful things and terrible suffering with no ability to escape, would Nietzsche say, well, if the experience turns out to be a net positive, then the kidnapping was justified? Of course not. The lack of consent would make the kidnapping unethical regardless of the outcome. But that is exactly what procreation is. It is placing someone in an inescapable situation they never agreed to enter. Nietzsche's desire to affirm life does not eliminate the consent violation. Nietzsche's claim smuggles assumption the assumption that existence is negative, but I'm sorry, or that it is positive. And the way that they're framing it is that the anti-natalists are the ones who are smuggling a assumption that existence is negative. But this is incorrect. The only assumption that anti-natalism requires is that imposing existence is a significant imposition. It causes irreversible conditions on someone without their consent, and therefore requires ethical justification. Um, However, the life affirming person sees existence as a gift, not an imposition. But calling a gift does not make it a gift. A gift that the recipient never asked for, cannot return, and may experience as a burden is not a gift. It is an imposition wrapped in manipulative language, is what I would say. The fact that a person, this is the whole discussion I had with Vegan Gaines, right? Because he's saying that most people enjoy life, therefore that makes it ethical to procreate. But just because a person has a positive experience with their life, that still does not justify imposing life onto someone else who may have a different experience, right? Why should someone else's positive experience determine someone else's fate? That is the framework of Nietzsche. And Nietzsche's position offers no answer except to insist that existence is obviously valuable without any evidence. So it's making assuming that a fact has been established without presenting any evidence. This is what they all do. This is what all the so-called people who have uh, attempted to debunk antinatalism, they actually have not. They don't even attempt to debunk it. They're making a lot of logical fallacies. So um, the Nietzsche analysis would evaluate antinatalism um, with the assumption that we're taking a position that a person who doesn't exist is being disturbed from non-existence. That we're acting as if the non-existent person has been deprived of their peaceful void, um, and that they actually had a desire to not be brought into existence. This represents the anti-natalist position. The anti-natalist position is actually much simpler. Before someone exists, there is no one to benefit from being created, but once they exist, there is someone who can be harmed. This asymmetry matters ethically. Um, Creating a person cannot benefit them before they exist because there's no one to receive the benefit, but it can harm them after they exist. This isn't given a preference for non existence, it's recognizing that harm requires a victim while a benefit requires a benefactor, and these don't exist at the same time of creation. There's a misalignment going on here that they seem to overlook. Nietzsche would say you can only ask you can only ask beings that exist. This is how they debunk antinatalism. You would have to exist in order to negate your non-existence or the imposition of life. But it doesn't dissolve the consent problem. It actually does the opposite. It reveals that procreation is uniquely problematic because in every other ethical situation, there is a possibility of obtaining consent, but with procreation, consent is completely impossible. This makes it more ethically suspect, not less. So there's two different framings. This is the Schopenhauer framing, which is life denial, aestheticism, or the life affirming framing, which is Nietzsche's position. The life denial framing is that parents impose existence on a being who cannot consent forcing them into a condition involving inevitable suffering, aging, and death. The life affirming framing says that parents grant the opportunity to exist, to experience, to love, and to create meaning. This is what I said in my last live stream about how they say that life is what you make it. No, it's not. It absolutely is not. So Nietzsche would suggest that these are equivalent perspectives with different valuations. Um, but actually, the former is correct, and the no, the former is correct, and the latter is actually misleading. So the anti-natalist position acknowledges the lack of consent, the inevitability of suffering, the inability to opt out. These are facts, not valuations. The life affirming is purely evaluate. It's a pure evaluation. It's not really fact based. Um, it uses like grants and an opportunity, right, to hide the fact that there is an actual imposition, an opportunity that you can't refuse, a gift that you can't reject. Um, and really it's just both it's repackaging of an imposition, of a trap, of enslavement, right? um the Nietzsche framework would ask, why are we giving preference to the first framing, to the anti-natalist framing? Because the first framing is accurate and honest about the actual imposition, while the latter uses rhetoric to obscure the actual imposition. um Now let's get into these logical fallacies. The first one is that his entire framework conflates strength with affirmation. Nietzsche assumed that strength and life affirmation are necessarily that they go hand in hand. He treated them as two aspects of the same phenomenon. The healthy, vital organism naturally affirms existence, and anyone who doesn't affirm life must be sick, weak, exhausted, or self deceived. This is demonstrably false. Now let's give another counterexample. Let me make sure this people's still here. Okay. Let's give another counterexample. Consider a person who wanted to end their life 20 years ago. That would be me, by the way. Um, they have continued existing not because they changed their mind, not because they learned to love their existence, not because their suffering was transformed into life affirmation, but purely through their own will to power, through their own discipline, willpower, and endurance. For 20 years, this person has continued living despite consistently wishing they had not been born. Every day represents a choice to persist in an existence they don't value. They haven't given up. They haven't been broken. They continue. This is not weakness. This is extraordinary strength. The person has maintained an existence they experience as meaningless through sheer force of will for 2 decades. They've endured not just external hardships, but the internal tension of wanting to die while choosing to live. Um, I'm using air quotes when I say choosing because I don't think that it actually is a choice. They've demonstrated discipline and persistence that exceeds what most people will ever exhibit. They don't affirm life. They've accepted their fate even though they don't love it. 20 years of endurance hasn't transformed their assessment that existence has a negative value. This proves that the person who has endured 20 years of maintaining a life that provides no meaning or satisfaction proves that the strength and affirmation are not necessarily connected. A person can be extraordinarily strong and still wish they had never been born. They can be capable of enduring life and yet experience existence as a burden. They can be disciplined enough to continue for decades and still assess that they would have been better off if they had not been brought into existence. They can be free from depression and illness and still not value their own existence. These combinations are possible. When confronted with someone who doesn't affirm life, Nietzsche would typically deploy one of several dismissals. You're depressed slash sick. This is medical or mental health pathologizing. You're weak, unable to bear life. This is a character dismissal, an ad hominem attack. You're in resentment. This is a psychological diagnosis. Your continued living proves that you secretly actually enjoy life. You're denying your actual lived experience and what your actual position actually is. You haven't tried hard enough to transform suffering into meaning. They're moving the goalposts. All of these dismissals and rhetorical escape tactics allow Nietzsche's position to avoid confronting the possibility that his framework can't accommodate. That a genuinely strong, healthy, clear thinking person might rationally conclude that existence has a negative value. Nietzsche would observe that weak, sick, and depressed people often want to die. From this conclusion, he concludes that wanting to die presupposes weakness, sickness, and depression. But this logic is backwards. Just because weak people often exhibit a trait does not mean that everyone who exhibits this trait is weak. Some people who want to die are weak, but some are extraordinarily strong, proven by the fact that they continue existing despite their preference for non existence year after year through will to power. This undermines Nietzsche's entire project in several ways. First, it makes his position unfalsifiable. Any counter example gets dismissed. If you don't affirm life, you you're not truly strong by definition. This is circular reasoning. Second, it reveals that life affirmation is a preference or orientation, not the natural expression of vitality. Some vital people affirm life, some vital people reject life. These are independent variables. Third, it shows that Nietzsche's philosophy is for a specific type of person, those who can or do experience existence as valuable, not as a universal truth about strength or health. Fourth, it means Nietzsche can't dismiss antinatalism by simply calling antinatalists weak. Most antinatalists demonstrate strength simply by the fact that they continue existing despite having no desire to do so. If anyone were to be honest about Nietzsche's position, they would have to admit that they assume that strength necessarily produces life affirmation, that anyone with vitality to endure life would eventually learn to love their existence. This is false. Some people who endure their existence do so without affirming life. They maintain their existence um, even though they don't value it through the will to power. They are strong in ways that Nietzsche's position did not account for, and strong enough to continue something they wish they had never begun. This breaks Nietzsche's framework entirely. Antinatalism describes people who find meaning through their struggle, who transform suffering into affirmation, um, because I guess I need to explain that antinatalism is not nihilistic. So that is the the will to power inverted. So you take the you take your involuntary existence and then you find strength from that, and that is the motivation for a lot of antinatalists. It's not weakness. It's not giving up. We actually believe that there is something that can be done about it. So the person who endures 20 years of wanting to die by continuing to live is not weak. They're not sick. They're not deceiving themselves. They're not simply oriented to reject life. Like, this is a conclusion that they have made rationally. It's not a bias. It's not because they've been because they've been hanging around the wrong people, or they just need to experience life differently or get better friends. Um, Nietzsche's philosophy has nothing to offer an anti-nihilist. Um, we're just two different types of beings. You have a predisposition and a bias towards affirming life. You're actually not objective. because you're not making an honest assessment of the actual imposition. You're just basically choosing to ignore the imposition with positive thinking to say, oh, just think about this, look at it from the bright side. That is not an objective viewpoint, because you're not even acknowledging the imposition. You're just basically choosing not to focus on it. The second flaw, they're conflating affirmation with the right to impose existence. Even if we were to accept that everything Nietzsche said was true, even if we were to accept that those who personally enjoy life and have achieved amor fati, which is the acceptance of fate, in all of its and life with all of its manifestations, there still is a logical error here, because a person can affirm their own existence, right? They can say that they were glad that they were born, but this still does not justify imposing that existence onto someone else, which is a different question. Should I bring other people into existence? These are different questions, and they require different justifications, and they have different answers. Nietzsche's position cannot address this, right? The person who says that they enjoy their life, that they are grateful that they were born, that they have found meaning through their struggle, that they have achieved amor fati, doesn't change anything about someone else's existence, right? Um, Maybe they would choose to be born if they could have been consulted in their state of non-existence. Maybe they still would have said yes. This still does not create a right to impose existence on another being without their consent. Someone else's positive experience does not give them permission to gamble with someone else's entire existence. They can love their own life while still recognizing that creating new lives is ethically problematic. This is a coherent position. It affirms the person's own existence while still rejecting the ethics of imposing existence on someone else who cannot give consent. And amor fati and antinatalism are not mutually exclusive. It is possible for one to accept their own fate while still maintaining that it is unethical to impose a similar fate onto someone else. Nietzsche's framework would assume that if you truly love life, you would naturally want to create more life. He would treat life affirmation as necessarily expansive, as something that overflows into wanting more existence, more consciousness, more beings. But this is a non sequitur. A person's experience as valuable does not automatically give them the right to impose experience on others, especially when they cannot obtain consent in advance. The person cannot opt out once they exist. The person, I mean, the experience or the imposition of life necessarily includes suffering. The outcome of the imposition of life is uncertain, right? They may not share your positive assessment, your positive valuation. So let's give some other counterfactual examples, right? Suppose that you love roller coasters, right? You enjoy the terror, the whatever the rush you get from getting on a roller coaster. You find it thrilling, meaningful, worthwhile. Does this give you the right to force someone else to get on a roller coaster, to strap them down and say that because you enjoy the roller coaster, that this other person is going to enjoy it? No, they're not. The other person could have a different experience than you. The other person could be terrified, they could vomit, they could slip out of the chair. Just because you enjoyed it does not mean that they're going to have the same experience. Now let's consider another example. You might find enjoyment in climbing mountains, right? This may be meaningful to you. Climbing a mountain may give you some sense of achievement that is valuable, right? But it does not create the conclusion that because you enjoy climbing a mountain, therefore you should force others to climb the mountain with you, right? It doesn't translate a right to impose the challenge on others. You may enjoy eating spicy foods, right? But That does not give you a right to sneak spicy foods onto somebody else, to sneak spices into their food and think that they're going to enjoy it. Oh, maybe if you just try it, you'll just love it. No, it does not give you the right to do that. Your experience of something as valuable does not give you the right to impose it on others without their consent, especially when that imposition is irreversible, inescapable, guaranteed to include significant suffering, and the outcome is uncertain. When Nietzsche takes the position that life is, and I love it, that is a statement about his experience and his existence. When he makes the leap that therefore creating more life is good, and therefore procreation is strength, he is subtly making a statement about imposing experience on others. These require different justifications. The first is about his personal assessment. The second is about ethics, rights, and the imposition of conditions on other beings. The anti-native position, the anti-natives may love their own life completely. They may find meaning in their own existence. Maybe they would not change anything about their own existence. Um, and they have accepted their own fate, amor fati, and yet they still may reject the premise that they have the right to impose existence on others. The person who enjoys their own existence but still refuses to impose it on others destroys Nietzsche's entire framework. It shows you can have complete personal affirmation of your own life without believing in the right to impose it on others. It demonstrates that amor fati doesn't necessarily lead to wanting expansion of existence. It exposes that life affirmation is about your relationship to your existence, not about creating existence for others. It proves that the question, is my life valuable to me, is separate from should I create lives for others. Nietzsche would want life affirmation to naturally overflow into creation, expansion, perpetuation, but this assumes facts without evidence. There is also a profound sense of arrogance and entitlement in Nietzsche's position when applied to existing people who don't share his assessment. Nietzsche's position is I love this. I love life. I would not change anything. But when he encounters someone else's who says they wish they had never been born, what right do these people have to say that we're wrong about our own experience, right? The person who has endured 20 years of an existence, right? The person who wanted to opt out 20 years ago, but still persevered. What right do these people have to say that they're wrong? That somebody actually told me that, by the way. Somebody told me that recently. This one of those soul contract people. Um, they said that our souls consented to being brought into existence, and I said, fine, fine. And again, I've already addressed the non-entity problem in my book. But what I told him is, I exist now. I don't want to exist now. So what is your response? And this person gaslit me and said that I was wrong, that I actually do want to exist, that I have been traumatized and I don't actually know what I want. So yeah, the whole soul contract thing, I want you to know that it's bullshit because they still maintain a position even when you are here, when you are um, a grown ass adult who actually knows what you want. Um, they're imposing their evaluation onto you. So this is what Nietzsche's framework does. Without getting into this whole metaphysical mysticism of a soul contract, right? They're going to say that you actually love your existence. You just don't realize it. Um, or if you were truly healthy, you would love your existence. This is dismissing someone else's lived experience because it contradicts your worldview, your philosophy, your bias, right? Um, Nietzsche's position would assume this is the gaslighting, right? That anti-natives constantly get. If someone genuinely did not value their existence, they would just Toyota Corolla themselves, right? That's what Vegan Gains said. Since they haven't Toyota Corolla themselves, um, they must value their existence, even if they claim otherwise. Their continued living reveals their true life affirmation. This is fundamentally false, demonstrably false, because it is conflating three different states. Never existing, right? Before you were brought into existence, you had no investment, there was no harm. Now you exist, you have a consciousness, you have experiences, you have relationships, commitments, you have a survival instinct, you have a fear of your own annihilation. And then the third state is dying, being dead. The process of dying plus the cessation of existence is painful and traumatic. These are not symmetrical, and you cannot return to the state of non-existence from the state of existence. So dying does not necessarily return you to the state of non-existence. Option one is no longer available. The non-existence that was taken from you is not an option. So dying does not return you to your state of non-existence. Now you only have the limited option to continue existing or dying. Someone can rationally prefer to or wish that they were never brought into existence while continuing to exist because they're already invested in their existence, right? They have relationships, commitments, survival instinct. Dying is not the same as never being brought into existence. All available options are bad. Continuing to exist is bad. Dying is also bad. So they're choosing the least bad option. Non-existing is good, right? If they were never brought into existence, that is what they would prefer. But dying is worse. So let's use another counterfactual analogy. Imagine someone kidnaps you and puts you in a boat in the middle of an ocean. Your options are to either stay on a boat. You don't want to stay on a boat, but I guess you want to survive, or you can jump in the ocean and drown a terrible, traumatic death. So you choose to stay on a boat. Does this prove that you actually wanted to be kidnapped? No. Does this prove that you were glad to be on a boat? No. Does this prove that your kidnapping was justified? No. Does this prove that you value being on a boat? No, it does not. It only reveals that given that you're already on a boat against your will, staying on a boat is preferable to drowning. Your continued presence on a boat does not justify the kidnapping. It does not mean you affirm being there. It just means that dying is worse than continuing in a situation you never wanted in the first place. Nietzsche's framework uses what economists call revealed preference. The idea that actions reveal true values. He would argue that you choose to keep living, therefore you must value life. But the revealed preference fallacy only works when alternatives are generally um when genuine equivalents are presented. Continuing to exist over dying does not prove that you value your existence. It does not prove that you're glad you were created. It doesn't prove that you affirm life, nor does it prove that existence is good. It only reveals that given that you already exist, continuing to exist is preferable to dying. Dying is worse than continuing. You're trapped between two bad options and choosing the least bad option. The person who wanted to no longer exist 20 years ago but continues to exist is not affirming life. They choose to continue, and I'm using the word choose in air quotes because it's not really a choice. They continue to exist not because it's good, because it's less bad than the alternative. This is not amor fati. This is not accepting your fate. At least, I mean, in a way, it is because you're accepting that this is what it is. This I just got fucked over, so I'm just going to accept the fact that I got fucked over. There's nothing I can do about it. But it doesn't mean that you were ever okay with it. It doesn't mean that you accepted that this was a fair outcome. Like if you had to do it over again, you would. Absolutely not. You're trapped between an impossible situation where all available options are bad, and you're choosing the least terrible one day after day for 20 years. So the person who didn't want to be brought into existence actually prefers never existing, right? This is a straw man. They're saying because you haven't opted out that means that you want to be brought into existence. No, what we wanted was to never be brought into existence in the first place. This is no longer an option. This has been foreclosed. There is no way to go back into non-existence. So the anti-natalists have taken a position that we can't do anything about our involuntary existence. It's too late to save us. We're already fucked. But we can save others, right? We can prevent others from following a similar fate, from being trapped between maintaining an involuntary existence or suffering a worse fate, which is dying. People keep saying that anti-natalism is a death cult. It's not a death cult because you can't die unless life has been posed on you in the first place. So there is no death. We don't procreate. Nobody dies without being brought into existence in the first place. So we don't have any children. None of our children have died because they don't exist. Those who procreate, that is a death cult. Your children are all going to die, and that is something that did not even have to happen. It was completely avoidable. So that is the death cult. The pro-life position is a death cult. Let's see if I have any comments before I keep going. Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate it. I put a lot of thought into it. I think this me addressing individual arguments that people make is in a vacuum. It's not really going to be helpful. I think for me to do it from Nietzsche's framework, it actually is more exhaustive because it's more philosophical. And I'm going to do the same thing with veganism. Once I'm done with this one, I'm going to come back and do analysis of veganism. Why it is half-hearted aestheticism and it's completely paradoxical. Um, they're farming life in one respect while denying it in the other way. It is incoherent. You can't to be a vegan while procreating is logically inconsistent. I know. Don't make assumptions until you actually hear me present the argument. Um, there's so many logical fallacies with Nietzsche's framework. First, that if you continue living as opposed to terminating your life, you actually affirm life. This is false. You continue living only because you prefer to not die. It doesn't mean that you want to be brought into existence in the first place. It doesn't mean that you're weak or that a person who is strong would necessarily affirm life. The person who has existed for 20 years despite not wanting to has already proven their strength without affirming life. Um, all right. I don't want to be repetitive. Let's just go through these logical fallacies step by step. Um, the first logical fallacy is circular reasoning. Circular reasoning. Life affirmation is what healthy organisms naturally do. If you don't affirm life, you're not healthy. Therefore, anyone who doesn't affirm life is unhealthy by definition. This makes the claim This makes the claim unfalsifiable. Any counter example of a healthy person who doesn't affirm life gets redefined out of existence by declaring them not truly healthy, right? So anyone who doesn't affirm life is not healthy. If you're an anti-natalist, it's because you're unhealthy. That is begging a question. The conclusion is built into the premise without actually establishing the argument. The second logical fallacy, affirming the consequence. Nietzsche would observe a correlation and incorrectly infer causation in one direction. If someone is weak or sick, they often want to die. If the person wants to die, excuse me, if someone is weak or sick, they want to die or often want to die. The, this person wants to die, therefore, this person is weak or sick. This is a classic logical fallacy. The fact that a weak person may want to die does not mean that everyone who wants to die is weak. The person who has endured their existence for 20 years proves this conclusively. The false dichotomy. Nietzsche would present only two options: either you affirm life or you're weak and sick in denial or resentful. This ignores numerous other possibilities. Strong people um, gen- often genuinely don't affirm life. People who partially affirm life, some aspects but not others. People who affirm conditionally, and those um, whose non-affirmation comes from rational assessment, not weakness. The equivocation. Nietzsche would use the word strength to mean two different things and conflate them. The capacity to endure existence and overcome obstacles, and that affirming life means saying yes to existence. He would then treat these as the same thing, arguing that if you have one, you must have the other. But the person who has endured their involuntary existence for 20 years has strength in the first sense, without strength in the second sense. They have the strength to endure life, yet they have rejected the position of affirming life. False equivalence. Nietzsche would treat three fundamentally different states as equivalent: never existing, existing, and dying. These are not symmetrical choices. Once you exist, you cannot return to never existing. The asymmetry destroys uh, the revealed preference fallacy. The non sequitur, he makes the logical leap that a person who loves their existence would necessarily want to create more life. This does not naturally follow from the first. Your personal preference of something as valuable does not give you the right to impose it on others without their consent. These require separate justifications. Hasty generalization fallacy. Nietzsche would observe a pattern in some cases and incorrectly generalize them to all cases. Some weak people would prefer to not live. Therefore, all people who don't want to live are weak or sick. This ignores counterexamples like the 20-year endurer who demonstrates extraordinary strength while wishing they had never been brought into existence. The appeal to nature fallacy. Nietzsche would argue that healthy organisms naturally affirm life, therefore, affirmation is correct, good, and how things should be. But what is natural isn't necessarily good or correct. Cancer is natural, infanticide is natural in some species. Natural doesn't equate to good. Composition fallacy. Nietzsche would observe individual life affirmers often create good things, therefore, life affirmation is universally good. What parts of life affirmation isn't necessarily true of the whole? Universal affirmation as a policy. Question begging. Nietzsche's entire framework that would assume what it's trying to prove. It assumes that existence is valuable, the thing which is still in dispute. Then it argues that antinatalism is wrong because it denies this value. And whatever existence is valuable is precisely what antinatalists question. So the argument is it goes in a circle. It's using the conclusion as a premise. Ad hominem, excuse me. Rather than addressing antinatalist arguments, Nietzsche's framework would attack the person making the argument. You're weak, therefore your argument is wrong. You're sick, therefore your position is invalid. You're resentful, therefore I can dismiss your claims. The origin of an idea doesn't determine its merit. Arguments must be evaluated on their merits, not the characteristics of the person presenting the argument. A straw man, excuse me. Nietzsche would portray anti-nihilists as universally weak, exhausted, unable to cope with life. He would attack this weak person rather than engaging with this sophisticated anti-nihilist position about consent, asymmetry, and the ethics of imposing existence. The strongest anti-nihilist position that even if you love your own life, you shouldn't impose existence on others without their consent would necessarily go unaddressed because Nietzsche would be busy attacking a caricature or an archetype. The no true Scotsman fallacy. When confronted with counterexamples, Nietzsche would shift the definition. Strong people affirm life. This person is strong but doesn't affirm life. Well, they're not truly a strong person. This is moving the goalposts to exclude inconvenient evidence. This makes a position unfalsifiable. Moving the goalposts, Nietzsche would shift his criteria when challenged. His first claim, if you were strong, you would affirm life. When it's shown strong people who don't affirm life, then you're not truly strong, or you're sick, or they haven't endured long enough, or they're in self deception. Each time the original claim is challenged, the requirements change. Appeal to consequences. Nietzsche would argue if everyone were anti-nihilist, humanity would end. Therefore, anti-nihilism is wrong. But bad consequences don't make a position false or invalid. An anti-nihilist might accept this consequence as preferable to the cycle of suffering. This is another thing that they always talk about because the anti-nihilist position is toward human extinction, but they just presuppose that human extinction is necessarily bad, therefore anti-nihilism is bad. Or they'll make another assumption that if humans go extinct, then or there's a dramatic decline in the human population, that would lead to bad outcomes for those who are still here, or it would lead to bad outcomes for animal wildlife. That is an appeal to consequences. That is a logical fallacy. It doesn't negate the ethics of imposing existence on someone. You've completely shifted the argument. You haven't even addressed the argument. You're basically saying that even if imposing existence on someone is unethical, you would still choose the unethical approach because you're going to get the consequences that you want. This is a logical fallacy. False cause. Nietzsche would observe sick people often don't affirm life, therefore, not affirming life indicates sickness, but the correlation does not prove causation. It could be. Sickness causes a denial of life affirmation. Non-affirmation causes sickness. And a third factor causes both, but there is no causal relationship at all. Because they're saying that anti-nihilism itself is what's making people sick. That because you're refusing to affirm life, that is the cause of your suffering. That if you would just reject anti-nihilism and just affirm life like everybody else, and learn to enjoy, well, I guess that would be a more facti. If you would just embrace it, then you would actually enjoy life, right? If you just learn to accept that life isn't fair, but just accept it. This life doesn't have to be ethical. Just be at peace with it. Just go meditate. Just go be at one with nature. Go climb the mountains. Go take a swim somewhere, and then you'll be at peace with your involuntary existence. No, absolutely not. The Texas sharpshooter fallacy. Nietzsche would look at a successful, thriving person who affirms life and says, see, life affirmation leads to flourishing. But he would ignore people who affirm life and still suffer. People who don't affirm life still accomplish things. This is a selection bias in his examples. He would draw the target around the bullet holes that support his theory. Argument from ignorance. Nietzsche would effectively argue, I can't imagine how a truly strong person would not affirm life, therefore it must not be possible. Personal inability to imagine something does not make it impossible. The 20-year endurer exists whether Nietzsche can imagine them or not. Appeal to emotion. Nietzsche would use evocative language, a more facile love of faith, saying yes to life, the courage to affirm, making affirmation sound noble and heroic. This is what Jordan Peterson did, by the way. That if you affirm life, that is somehow heroic, without even addressing the cowardice of imposing life on someone else for your own selfish validation. And finally, making denial sound cowardly and pathetic when it's actually the imposition of life to serve your own selfish gratification, which is cowardly and pathetic. These emotional appeals don't constitute logical proof. They're rhetoric designed to hide the unethical imposition, right, and make one position sound more attractive and the other repulsive. Excuse me. The privileged knowledge fallacy. Nietzsche would claim to know what other people really feel better than they do. You say that you don't value life, but your continued existence proves that you do. You're self-deceived about your true values. Your actions reveal that what you really think, regardless of what you claim. This is unfalsifiable and unverifiable. It allows Nietzsche and his minions to dismiss anyone else's stated experience by claiming to access superior knowledge about their actual experience and hidden truth about their own psychology. The revealed preference fallacy. This fallacy is central. The argument is your actions reveal your true values. You're continued living rather than dying, therefore you must value life. It fails because the revealed preference fallacy only works when the alternatives are genuine equivalent options. The person can freely choose among them, right? This is the logical fallacy that Vegan Gains presented to me. So because I didn't Toyota Corolla myself, I must enjoy my involuntary existence. The choice reveals something beyond I prefer option A to option B, right? Option A is non-existence. Option B is you exist, but dying is actually worse than continuing to live. But continuing to live and dying are not equivalent options. Never existing is what antinatalists want, but don't have the ability to access. Dying is a terrible process. It is not equivalent to never existing. Continue to exist might be less bad than dying, but it still is not good. Continuing to exist only reveals that they prefer to existing over going through the dying process, which is not good. Even if you don't exist, this is a problem that they don't understand. Nobody actually wants to die. Nobody does. Even the people who actually terminate their life, they don't actually want to die. What they want is to stop suffering, and they see it as their only escape. It still does not prove that nobody wants to die. So let's get that through your thick fucking skull. Nobody wants to die. Stop using that fucking argument. It's retarded. They prefer existing over dying. It doesn't prove that they're glad that they were brought into existence. It doesn't prove that they value their life. It doesn't prove that they actually affirm their existence. The 20-year endurer has already proved this. They continue living not because they value life, because dying is worse. They choose the least bad option among bad options. This is something that I think I already addressed in chapter one of my book. I didn't really go in this great detail because I didn't want chapter one to be so long, but I think I did. I think I addressed it sufficiently. Um, all of these uh, claims are unfalsifiable, right? They can none of these positions can be disproven. Every counter example has been dismissed. The strong person who doesn't affirm life, they're not truly strong. The healthy person who wants to die, they must be sick. Someone who endures life without transforming hasn't endured life long enough. Someone who explicitly denies affirmation is self deceived. Someone who continues living proves that they actually affirm life. This isn't philosophy, this is dogma. Actually, I'm going to say it outright. Nietzsche's philosophy is trash. It's absolute trash. Jordan Peterson seems to love Nietzsche. I'm not sure why. He rejects Schopenhauer. He rejects Benatar. Nietzsche's philosophy. This is not even. This is wishful thinking. This is optimism. A bunch of logical fallacies wrapped into what he calls the will to power and amor fati. Um, it creates so many logical fallacies. It builds an escape hatchet for every challenge to affirming life because they have an excuse for everything. Oh, you really enjoy life because you just didn't opt out, or you really don't know what you want. Listen, every justification for life affirmation is premised on a logical fallacy. So the life affirmation position um, purports to claim that they love their existence, they found meaning through their suffering, they prefer to affirm their own life as opposed to not denying life, right? They invite others to share their temperament. They can claim that life affirmation helps them to articulate to articulate their experience. But life affirmation cannot do these things. It cannot affirm that life denial is a weakness, a sickness, or that the person is defective. It cannot establish that a strong person necessarily affirms life. It cannot establish that continuing to live proves that you value life. It cannot establish that a personal affirmation justifies creating new life. It cannot establish that a personal orientation towards life affirmation is universally correct or applicable to everyone. It cannot establish that those who disagree are self deceived or defective. This matters because every attempt to debunk antinatalism is based on a logical fallacy. It really goes down to a personal preference that they prefer to be biased, to have a bias towards life affirmation, and they want everyone else to be biased towards life affirmation. But that's as far as it goes. Let me see if I have any comments because I'm almost finished. Absolute trash. You're correct. Absolute trash. I think you let shit people. No. Chickpea is not homophobic. She likes gay men. She doesn't like transgender. She doesn't like people trying to. Anyway, I'm not going to go into what she's not homophobic. She likes gay men. She explicitly said that gay men are usually nicer to her than straight men. I'm not sure what I didn't listen. I didn't listen to Amendo's video. I'm not sure what that's about. Uh, do, do you know what's the title? Is that I have no idea. Who is Uber Match? I don't know who that is. Oh, okay. I'll look him up. I'll look him up once I'm done with this live stream. Um, I'm pretty much done, but this pretty much um debunks their attempt to debunk antinatalism, because every attempt to debunk antinatalism is based on false premises and logical fallacies. Um, so really, if you want to disarm these attempts to debunk antinatalism, really this should be your go-to video or live stream, because this is it. I've just comprehensively debunked their attempt to debunk antinatalism. It's all nonsense. It's all rubbish. It's a bunch of bullshit. Um, there is no merit to any of their arguments, because they never address the imposition of life as being unethical. It's just reframing it as an opportunity, as a gift, as pathologizing the person who doesn't enjoy their life. They're assuming that because they enjoy their life, that somebody else would enjoy their life. They never actually address the ethical question. They can't. They don't want to engage, so they're going to dismiss and pathologize the person presenting the argument. Um, I, I mean, I think I've established that antinatalism survives any logical scrutiny. It's really unassailable. Um, Nietzsche's life affirmation framework relies on rhetoric, fallacies, and refusal to honestly confront the ethical problems of creating a person without their consent. Um, I'm still waiting for somebody to debunk antinatalism. Um, it's impossible. I don't think you can. The closest you can, the closest you can get to debunking antinatalism is making a technical argument about the asymmetry of a non-existent person, that the person who doesn't exist can't be harmed by being brought into existence. But I have already addressed this in chapter 2 of my book, which I'm going to be addressing. Hopefully, I'll be addressing that Friday or Saturday. But I'm going to do a follow up explaining the will to power, and um, how veganism is half-hearted asceticism, that it is incoherent. So before you unsubscribe, I would like you to hear me out. It's not that I reject veganism. It's not that I don't care about animals. I think that their approach is incorrect. I think there is a, like, if you're going to take an aesthetic approach to liberating animals, then it has to be all the way. It has to be full throated aestheticism, not just selective aestheticism. And really, the selective part is probably the least effective portion of aestheticism. So, with that being said, I'm going to end this live stream. Y'all have a good day. Um, yeah, let me see if finding. One last thing. I'm going to release my book again for free for those who want to read it, but I'm waiting for Finding Gnosis to let me know when he's going to ask, because I was trying to make it available for free. He never downloaded it. So he's going to be reviewing my book on his channel. And so I want to make sure that he gets it, because whenever I send out these notifications, people aren't getting it. So um, I'm going to wait until he actually is going to download it, and then I'll announce it to everybody. So for those of you who didn't download it yet,